Hello, nonfiction friends. I just finished cutting about 400 words from my debut nonfiction picture book, Woodwire Wings. I had seen the initial sketch dummy, and when I looked at the illustrator's drawings, I realized that the illustrator was able to say a lot with the drawings that I no longer needed to say in words. And one area where I noticed this in particular was in the areas where I was providing some historical context. So today I want to talk a little bit about historical context and how to work that into your book in a successful way. So the first example I want to talk about is I want to talk about Michelle Markel's Brave Girl, and I've got a copy of that right here. So this is the story of Clara Lemlich, who helped instigate the shirtwaist workers' strike of 1919. And on this particular page, you see the illustrator Melissa Sweet has drawn rows of girls who are working in the factory. They're sewing. And let's read what Michelle says here. From dawn to dusk, she's locked up in a factory. Rows and rows of young women bend over their tables, stitching collars, sleeves, and cuffs as fast as they can. Hurry up, the bosses yell. Rat-a-tat-tat, hisses Clara's machine. The sunless room is stuffy from all the bodies crammed inside. There are 2 filthy toilets, 1 sink, and 3 towels for 300 girls to share. So Michelle's needing to provide this historical context so people will understand the conditions that Clara and the shirtwaist workers faced so that they would be prompted to strike. Now, Michelle could have gotten far away from her protagonist. She could have just said, the conditions in the factory were terrible. The doors were locked. There were just a couple of toilets. They had to work faster and faster and faster. Instead, she keeps Clara in the center of the story. And so the description is related to what Clara experiences. She's right in the middle of it. It's in her words. She's locked up in a factory. The young women bend over the tables. Clara's machine hisses. So instead of just sort of breaking out of Clara's story and giving us a little context and then going back and putting the light back on Clara, Michelle is keeping Clara in the middle of the context. And I think this is where writers are most successful. Another book where I think the author has done a really good job of incorporating context while keeping the focus on the main character of the story is the book The Youngest Marcher by Cynthia Levinson. And you'll have to excuse me because my copy went back to the library, so I'm working from a printout. But here's what Cynthia writes. Audrey knew all about segregation. She knew to pay the driver at the front of the bus, then step off and walk around to the back door. Drink from the fountain with the dirty bowl and warm water. Use the freight elevator at department stores downtown. Front row seats, cool water, elevators, white-gloved operators. Law said those were for white folks. So again, Cynthia could have introduced her main character, Audrey, and what's going on, the civil rights movement. And then she could have taken a step back and said, okay, now I'm going to tell you a little bit about how it was for Black people at the time. They couldn't ride in the front of the bus. They couldn't drink from the water fountains. They couldn't even ride up the regular elevators in a department store. But Cynthia Levinson doesn't do that. Instead, she talks about the civil rights, the situation for Black people in Alabama through the eyes of Audrey, what Audrey would have experienced. And so that's another really effective way of dropping context into your story without taking the spotlight off of your main character. Now, while we're talking about Cynthia Levinson's book, I want to point out one more thing that I think is really interesting about how she handles context. Because a lot of books nowadays address some difficult topics for young children. For example, there are elements of the civil rights movement that may be very difficult for kids to handle, or discrimination. So one way to handle some of these complex issues is to let your photos do more of the heavy lifting, so you don't have to go into a lot of detail. So here's another page from Cynthia Levinson's book. And this one talks about when the people actually went to protest, what they talked about in their testimonials. So one says, white store owners won't hire me. Ku Kluxers chased me. Policemen called me names. The hateful stories made Audrey squirm. She tried to tell her mama, that's not right. Shh. Now here's the thing. A lot of kids may not know about the Ku Klux Klan. That's a complicated topic for a lot of kids. So instead of trying to explain that in the book, which would really bog down the pacing, Cynthia Levinson and her illustrator, Vanessa Brantley Newton, whom I absolutely love, decided instead just to give kids an idea of what the Ku Klux Klan might be through an illustration. So I think that's a really effective way sometimes of tackling a complicated issue. And this isn't the only book that does this. So this is another favorite book of mine, Debbie Levy's I Dissent, about Ruth Bader Ginsburg. And it's illustrated by Elizabeth Bradley. So early in the book, Debbie Levy's talking about discrimination. And she says, sometimes Ruth and her parents took car trips out of the crowded city. As they drove past a hotel in Pennsylvania, Ruth saw a sign, no dogs or Jews allowed. This is how it was in those days. Hotels, restaurants, even entire neighborhoods announcing. And then you see more signs with pictures. No Jews, no colored, no Mexican, whites only. So again, discrimination is a really tough issue for kids. And in a lot of cases, it would take a lot of words to explain what we can do very simply with images like Elizabeth Bradley has done. And this is not the only book where I've seen authors and illustrators rely on signs. So for example, I was just reading Rob Sanders' book, Pride, the Harvey Milk story. And there's one section where he's trying to explain discrimination against gay people. And instead of explaining it with a lot of words, he shows people in a crowd holding signs. And again, that's a really effective way to do that. So just a couple of parting thoughts. When you're trying to provide historical context in your nonfiction picture book, don't break away from your main character to provide that context. Always be filtering the context that's needed through the eyes of your protagonist. Keep them in the scene and show how they experience the world during that time period. Also, consider what you can do with pictures instead of words. For example, if your book is set during the Victorian period, maybe it's enough for students and readers to see people in Victorian dress and horse-drawn carriages. You don't necessarily need to explain in great detail. Kids will see that picture and they'll know where you are in rough time and place. Again, if you were out in the open prairie in the Old West, that might provide enough context too. So consider what your words really need to say versus what the illustrator can show. So those are just a couple of ideas for how to provide historical context in your book without getting far too wordy, which is certainly something that I'm always in danger of doing. All right, take care.